It's a common instinct, isn't it? Whenever we see a problem out there in society, maybe it's declining trust, or communities just feeling like they're fraying at the edges, our first thought is often, hey, there ought to be a law about that. But is that really the right answer? Is it always the answer? In this explainer, we're going to dive deep into a really crucial idea, one that's right at the heart of liberty, understanding the huge difference between what law can do and what it simply cannot.
So yeah, let's start right there with that central question. When our culture feels like it's struggling, is slapping a new law on the books really the solution? It's so easy to look to government for all the answers, right? But what we're going to do here is challenge that idea. We're going to look deeper and try to understand the proper role and, yeah, the profound limits of law, especially if we want to live in a free society. And this quote, this really gets to the core of what we're talking about today. Government is powerful, no doubt about it. But, and this is a huge but, it is not all powerful. It was never even meant to be. See, some problems, yeah, you can solve them with legislation. But so many others, they can only be touched by things like culture, by character, by the simple choices you and I make every single day. And knowing the difference between those two things, well, that's absolutely key to keeping our freedom.
All right, let's get into it. Section 1, law versus culture, because if we really want to understand the limits of government, we have got to get crystal clear on the very different jobs these two things have in our society. So let's start with the law. What's its purpose? What's it actually for? Well, its job is absolutely vital, but it's also really specific and limited. The law is there to prevent injustice, to protect our rights, and to maintain basic public order. It deals with what we do on the outside, actions that can harm other people. But here's what it's not designed to do. It can't create virtue, it can't instill wisdom in us, and it definitely can't replace our own conscience. Think of it this way. Law can restrain evil, but it can't manufacture goodness. That's a powerful distinction.
Okay, so if the law can't make people good, then what does? The answer is culture. And you can really see the difference it makes. When you have a strong culture, one built on shared values and social norms, you actually need less government regulation. People trust each other more. It's what makes freedom actually work, what makes it sustainable. But flip that around. A weak culture? Well, that requires constant enforcement. It leads to more and more bureaucracy. And eventually, it invites the government to step in with force, with coercion, because people have stopped governing themselves.
And hey, this is not some new idea. The American founders were keenly aware of this whole distinction. I mean, think about it. They designed a constitution that specifically restrains government power. Why? Because they were counting on the people having a certain level of civic virtue. They knew, deep down, that liberty needs a moral people to survive. But, and this is the kicker, they also knew you can't just legislate morality from the top down. It doesn't work that way. It has to bubble up from our families, from our faith, from our local community.
Okay, that brings us right to our second section, when law oversteps. So what happens when we forget this crucial difference? What happens when we start asking the law to do the heavy lifting that only culture is built for?
Well, this is where things get really problematic. Because when we try to slap a legal fix onto a cultural breakdown, we don't actually solve the root problem. Instead, we kick off this dangerous, vicious cycle, a downward spiral that ends up hurting both our government and our society.
And here's how that vicious cycle works. It's a two-step trap. Step 1, as we demand more and more laws to fix cultural problems, the law just naturally gets heavier. It gets more and more intrusive in our everyday lives. And that leads to step 2. As the government takes on all that new responsibility, our culture gets weaker. We start to outsource our own personal and community duties to the state. We become less responsible for ourselves and for each other. And that cultural weakness, well, it just creates more calls for, you guessed it, even more laws. And around we go.
This cycle isn't just a theory. It leads to 3 very specific dangers. First, you get over-criminalization. This is where totally ordinary behaviors suddenly get tangled up in this massive web of regulations. Second, the politicization of virtue. Morality stops being something we all strive for together and instead becomes a weapon, a tool to use in a political power struggle. And third, and this one is huge, we see a loss of persuasion. Sure, people might comply on the outside just to avoid getting punished, but on the inside, they're resisting, and we lose the art of actually reasoning with each other.
So what's the alternative to this mess? Well, that brings us to a really powerful way to think about this. Section 3 is all about this idea. A floor, not a ceiling.
Okay, this is maybe the most important takeaway. Think of law and culture as partners, but with totally different jobs. The law sets the floor. It establishes the absolute bare minimum standards of behavior we need to prevent society from falling into total chaos. It's there to protect our basic rights. That's the floor. But culture sets the ceiling. It's what defines our aspirations. It's about what we're all striving to become, a society built on honesty and kindness and responsibility. You see the difference? A truly healthy society has a really high ceiling and a pretty light floor.
All right, this brings us to our final and honestly most important section, because this one is all about you and me. It's about our role. Section 4, the work that is ours.
The principle here is so simple, but it is incredibly profound. Self-government requires self-restraint. Think about it. If we want to live in a society that governs itself, then it has to start with each of us governing ourselves. The moment we start expecting the government to enforce our personal discipline or to solve every little problem in our community, well, at that moment, we're giving up the very responsibility that makes freedom possible in the first place. We're essentially outsourcing self-restraint.
So where does that self-restraint even come from? It's not magic. It's formed in these places. It doesn't come from Congress or the State House. It comes from our homes, our schools, our faith communities, our neighborhoods. Culture is shaped by the little things, by the daily example we set for each other. When we teach our kids honesty, when we take responsibility, when we care for a neighbor. It happens in all those small, non-governmental spaces of our lives. This is the work that law can and should protect, but it can never ever create it from scratch.
So, what can we actually do about this? Here's a super practical 4-step plan. First, pick a cultural issue that you genuinely care about. Second, and this is the big one, before you immediately jump to demanding a new law, stop and ask yourself honestly, is this problem best solved by force, by a law, or is it better addressed through example and persuasion? Third, get active. Go out and strengthen one of those non-government institutions, your family, a local school, a volunteer group, whatever it is. And finally, a small challenge. In one difficult conversation you have this week, make a conscious choice to practice persuasion instead of falling back on coercion.
Let's end with this powerful thought right here. Freedom survives, not when the government does more and more, but when citizens, when we, do more of the things that law simply cannot do. Look, the government can and should restrain evil. That's its job. But it can never, ever manufacture goodness. That work, the most essential work of building a good society, belongs to us. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Are we actually doing the work that only we can do? Thanks for joining me for this Explain.